The library was silent, but the heat outside the stone walls was rising. A young scribe held a small clay tablet in his hands, his fingers tracing the wet marks made by a reed pen. In that moment, a sudden fire broke out in the city of Nineveh. The buildings began to crumble, and the shelves holding thousands of tablets crashed to the floor. The scribe ran for his life, leaving the records behind. He thought everything was lost. He believed the stories, and the laws of his people would turn to dust in the flames. But something strange happened. The intense heat of the fire did not destroy the clay. Instead, it baked the tablets, making them as hard as stone. Thousands of years later, an archaeologist brushed away the dry dirt of the desert. He found the tablets perfectly preserved. The fire that was meant to destroy the library had actually saved it for the future. How many other stories have survived because of a lucky mistake? We often think of books as fragile things made of paper and ink. We think they are easily broken or burned. However, the history of the book is actually a history of survival. It is a story of human resilience. Before we had libraries filled with paper, we had to find a way to make our thoughts permanent. We had to move from speaking to writing. This transition was not easy or fast. It took centuries of experimentation and many failures. In the beginning, there were no alphabets. There were only pictures and symbols scratched into the earth. People wanted to share their knowledge with their children, but voices disappear as soon as the breath leaves the lungs. They needed a container for their ideas. They needed a vessel that could travel across time. Imagine a world where every piece of information you know must be memorized. If you forget a detail, that knowledge is gone forever. If a teacher dies before passing on a story, the story dies with them. This was the reality for the earliest humans. They lived in a world of disappearing words. They looked at the stars and the seasons, wanting to record the patterns they saw. The first books were not books at all. They were the walls of dark caves and the surfaces of heavy stones. But stone is difficult to carry, and caves cannot move. The search for a better way began with a single mark in the mud. In the hot sun of ancient Mesopotamia, the first books were born from the earth itself. Scribes sat by the riverbanks, scooping up handfuls of wet clay. They shaped the mud into flat rectangles, smoothing the surface with their palms. Using a sharpened piece of wood, they pressed wedge-shaped marks into the soft clay. This was cuneiform. It was heavy, it was messy, and it was difficult to store. A single long story might require dozens of heavy tablets. If you dropped one, your chapter would shatter into 100 pieces. Further south, along the Nile River, a different kind of life was beginning for the written word. The Egyptians looked at the tall green reeds growing in the water. They pulled the papyrus plants from the mud and peeled away the outer skin. They sliced the inner pith into thin strips and laid them side by side. By pressing these strips together and drying them under heavy weights, they created a material that was light and flexible. This was the ancestor of paper. It felt smooth under the hand, and it could be rolled into long scrolls. A scribe in Egypt would sit cross-legged on the floor, holding a long roll of papyrus across his knees. He used a brush made of a crushed reed and ink made from soot and water. He wrote from right to left, his hand moving in a steady rhythm. The scroll could be 20 or 30 feet long. To find a specific piece of information, a reader had to unroll the entire length of the plant. It was like searching for a single fish in a very long river. These early books were precious and rare. Only a very small number of people knew how to read or write. It was a secret language for kings and priests. A single scroll could cost as much as a small house. Because they were so valuable, books were often kept in beautiful jars or wrapped in fine linen. But papyrus had a weakness. It was made from a plant, and plants eventually rot. In the humid air, the pages grew soft and fell apart. In the dry desert, they became brittle and snapped like dry leaves. The humans of the past realized that if they wanted their ideas to live forever, they needed something stronger than a riverweed. As the Roman Empire grew, the demand for information increased. People wanted news, poetry, and laws. But the scroll was starting to fail as a technology. Imagine trying to read a long story while walking or sitting in a crowded market. You would need both hands to hold the heavy rolls of papyrus. If you wanted to check a fact at the end of the scroll, you had to spend minutes unrolling and re-rolling the material. It was clumsy and slow. The scroll was a wall between the reader and the information. During this time, a new material appeared, called parchment. It was made from the skins of animals such as sheep or goats. The skins were soaked in lime, stretched on wooden frames, and scraped with a curved knife until they were thin and white. Parchment was much stronger than papyrus. You could fold it without it breaking. You could write on both sides. But it was incredibly expensive. To make one large book, a farmer might have to give up his entire flock of sheep. It was a luxury that most of the world could not afford. The biggest failure of the ancient book, however, was its isolation. Because every book had to be copied by hand, there were very few copies of any work. If a library burned down, the knowledge inside vanished from the earth. There was no backup system. In the Great Library of Alexandria, hundreds of thousands of scrolls were gathered in one place. It was the greatest collection of human thought in history. When that library was destroyed, humanity lost centuries of medical knowledge, historical records, and beautiful poetry. This was the dark age for the book. Progress felt like it had stopped. For hundreds of years, books remained locked away in monasteries and palaces. They were chained to desks so that no one could steal them. A monk might spend his entire life copying just 1 or 2 Bibles. He would sit in a cold, dim room, his eyes aching from the small light of a candle. He wrote letter by letter, day after day. One mistake could ruin a week of work. The book was a prisoner of the scribe's slow hand. It seemed that the written word would always be a slow, silent thing, far away from the lives of ordinary people. By the middle of the 14th century, Europe was in a state of crisis. The Black Death had taken the lives of millions. Cities were empty and the social order was breaking. However, this tragedy created an unexpected problem for the world of books. Because so many people had died, there were huge piles of old clothes and rags left behind. At the same time, more people were moving to the cities and starting businesses. They needed to keep records. They needed to learn how to read. The traditional way of making books using expensive animal skins and slow scribes could not keep up with the new world. There simply weren't enough sheep in the world to provide parchment for everyone who wanted to learn. The price of books stayed high while the hunger for knowledge grew. People were frustrated. They had ideas to share about science, religion, and trade, but they had no way to spread those ideas quickly. The gatekeepers of knowledge held the keys tightly. In the city of Mainz, Germany, a man named Johannes Gutenberg was facing his own crisis. He was a goldsmith who had lost his fortune in a failed business deal. He had tried to sell mirrors to religious pilgrims, but the plan had collapsed. He was in debt and under pressure. He needed a way to make money. But he was also obsessed with a secret project. He spent his nights in a workshop, working with heavy metals and thick oils. His neighbors wondered what he was doing. They heard the sound of a heavy press banging late into the night. Gutenberg was trying to solve the problem of the slow hand. He knew that woodblock printing existed, where an entire page was carved into a piece of wood. But wood is soft. After a few hundred copies, the letters become blurry and break, and if you made a mistake in one word, you had to carve the entire page again. He needed a way to make letters that were hard, identical, and movable. He was looking for a way to break the language into pieces and then put it back together. The turning point came when Gutenberg combined 3 different technologies that already existed. He took the wine press used by farmers to crush grapes. He took the metal casting techniques he had learned as a goldsmith. And he took the new, cheaper paper that was being made from old rags. He sat at his workbench and carved a single letter A into a steel punch. He used that punch to create a mold, and into that mold, he poured a mixture of melted lead and tin. When the metal cooled, he had a perfect hard letter that could be used thousands of times. He created hundreds of these small metal pieces letters, commas, and periods. He placed them into a wooden frame to form words and sentences. This was movable type. If he finished printing one page, he could simply unlock the frame, rearrange the letters, and start the next page. He didn't have to carve anything new. He was playing with the DNA of language. The first major test was the printing of the Bible. It was a massive project. He needed to print 188 copies. This might sound like a small number today, but at the time, there were only a few thousand Bibles in all of Europe. As the heavy wooden press came down on the paper, the ink was forced into the fibers. The result was a page of perfect black text. It was cleaner and easier to read than anything written by a monk. Gutenberg's invention was a spark in a dry forest. Suddenly, a book that used to take a year to copy could be produced in a few days. The cost of books began to drop, but more importantly, the speed of ideas began to accelerate. When you can print 1,000 copies of a map or a medical theory, you can no longer destroy that information. It is everywhere at once. The book had finally escaped the chains of the monastery. It was now a tool for the traveler, the student, and the rebel. The success of the printing press did not mean that books became perfect overnight. There was a long, difficult struggle to make reading a part of daily life. In the 1600s and 1700s, many governments and leaders were afraid of the power of the printed word. They tried to control what was printed. They created lists of forbidden books. If a printer published the wrong opinion, his shop could be burned down and he could be sent to prison. The books themselves were still quite large and heavy. They were usually bound in thick leather and kept on high shelves. For a long time, there was no such thing as a pocketbook. If you wanted to read, you had to stay at home or go to a library. The idea of reading for fun was still a new concept. Most people used books for serious things like religion or law. The language used in these books was often very formal and difficult for a regular person to understand. Another challenge was the literacy of the public. Even though books were becoming cheaper, most people still could not read. Parents had to decide if they would send their children to work in the fields or to a small school to learn their letters. It was a slow progress that took generations. Teachers used horn books, small wooden paddles with the alphabet protected by a thin layer of transparent animal horn. Children traced the letters with their fingers, dreaming of the day they could read a real story. In the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution changed the book again. Steam-powered presses could print thousands of pages an hour. Paper was now made from wood pulp instead of expensive rags, making it incredibly cheap. This was the era of the penny dreadful and the serialized novel. Authors like Charles Dickens wrote stories that were published in small chapters every week. People waited at the docks for the ships to arrive with the next part of the story. The book was no longer a luxury. It was a common companion. It was in the pockets of soldiers and the bags of factory workers. The true breakthrough for the modern book happened when it became a symbol of personal freedom. In the 20th century, we saw the arrival of the paperback. Before this, books were still seen as somewhat formal objects. But the paperback was different. It was small, it was colorful, and it was meant to be carried everywhere. You could read it on a bus, at the beach, or under the covers of your bed at night. It made literature accessible to everyone regardless of their wealth. Think about the physical experience of a book, the smell of the paper, the sound of the page turning, and the weight of the story in your hands. These details create a connection between the reader and the author that is different from any other medium. In the age of television and film, many people predicted that books would disappear. They said that people would rather watch a screen than read a page. They thought the book was an old technology that had finished its work. But the book survived. It survived the radio, the cinema, and the internet. In fact, digital technology gave the book a new life. E-readers allowed people to carry thousands of stories in a device thinner than a single magazine. Audiobooks allowed us to listen to stories while we drove to work or cooked dinner. We returned to the ancient tradition of oral storytelling, but with the convenience of modern electronics. The breakthrough was not just in how we read, but in who could write. Today, anyone with a computer can publish a book. The barriers that Gutenberg faced are gone. The gatekeepers have lost their power. A girl in a small village can write a story and share it with a reader on the other side of the planet in seconds. The book has become a global conversation. It is no longer just a record of the past. It is a living, breathing map of the human heart. As we look back at this 5,000-year journey, what is the life lesson of the book? It is the lesson of resilience. The book has been burned, censored, and ignored. It has been made of mud, plants, animal skins, and light. Yet it remains. It remains because we have a deep human need to be understood. We have a need to leave a mark behind. A book is a way of saying, I was here. This is what I felt. This is what I learned. When you read a book, you are performing a miracle. You are looking at small black marks on a white surface and seeing entire worlds. You are hearing the voice of someone who might have died hundreds of years ago. You are traveling across time and space without moving from your chair. This is why books are so powerful. They allow us to inhabit the minds of other people. They teach us empathy. They show us that our struggles are not new and that we are not alone. In a world that moves faster every day, the book asks us to slow down. It asks us to focus. It is a quiet form of resistance against the noise of modern life. When you open a book, you are entering a private space where no one can follow you. It is a conversation between you and the author. It is a place where you can find courage when you are afraid and comfort when you are sad. So, the next time you hold a book in your hands, remember its long struggle. Remember the scribe in the fire, the monk in the cold room, and the printer at his heavy press. They work so that these words could reach you. The book is a gift from the past to the future. It is a bridge made of paper and ink, and as long as there is one person with a story to tell and another person willing to listen, the life of the book will never end. It is a story that is still being written, one page at a time.